Hey guys. We ain't got no spark. This is the Poulan string trimmer from the previous carb rebuild video. I'm finally getting around to replacing the ignition coil on it. The first thing I noticed on this trimmer is that the bottom is covered with mud. This design has the spark plug on the bottom, so it's possible the spark plug wire just has some corrosion on it. So I'm going to yank the boot off of it. And here the clip came off with the boot. But the wire looks fine. There's no corrosion on it. Here's the clip in the boot. And it doesn't look corroded either. Now if it was corroded, you could clean the corrosion off of the clip and reinstall it 90 degrees to where it was installed before. There's a hole in the wire where the clip sticks into, so I'm going to make a new bonus hole 90 degrees from the old one, and then put the clip back in, but install it into the new bonus hole. That gives a new clean point of contact on the spark plug wire. But that's not going to work here. In this case, we're going to have to replace the ignition coil. The ignition coil is under this shroud up in this area here. Now it might be tempting to just cut that shroud off with the Dremel tool. It'd sure make accessing the coil easier, but we're going to do it the proper way, which is to completely disassemble the power head. There's two 4mm bolts on the bottom that hold the shroud on. Then we need to separate the power head from the shaft. There's one bolt here in the middle that actually holds the shaft on. So I'm going to loosen that. Now you want to make sure you have both the power head and the shaft supported when you do this. I've got the shaft supported in a bicycle vise, and then I'm supporting the power head with my other hand. And then you can just wiggle the power head off. Then we need to remove the handle. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bolts here to remove. So once you loosen all of those bolts, then you can just lift the right side of the handle off. Then I'll remove the last two 4mm bolts from the other side of the handle. There's a T15 screw in the left side handle that retains the throttle cable, so we need to remove that. And then we can disconnect the throttle cable from the trigger. Lastly, there's a connection on the kill switch wire. This you can just squeeze and pull apart to separate. Now that we have our power head separated, we still have to get that front shroud off. Before we can do that, we need to remove the clutch. There's a T15 screw inside the clutch, but if we try to turn it, the whole engine turns over. It won't loosen unless we can stop the engine from turning. To do that, we're going to have to push rope. I know, normally when that happens it's not intentional, but this time we're going to do it on purpose. So I'm going to remove the spark plug, and then we need to get the piston to the bottom of its stroke. So I'm putting a screwdriver in here and then rotating the engine to find out when it's at the bottom. Here it is at the top. Here it's at the bottom. Now we can start pushing rope. Just keep feeding the rope in there. You want to fill the whole cylinder up with rope so that when we turn the engine, the rope compresses and stops the engine from turning. They make a special tool for this. It's called a piston stop. But if you don't have one, you can just do this rope trick. So now, when I turn the clutch bolt, I'm able to loosen it. So that part I'm removing is called the clutch drum. The part that's still on the engine is the clutch itself. You'll notice on the clutch there's the word off and an arrow. That's telling you which way you need to turn it to take it off. Some of these are left-hand thread, some are normal. We'll also need a special socket to do this. This socket has 2 pins on the bottom which engage with the clutch. You'll need a 19mm or a 3/4 inch wrench to use the socket. Now the clutch will just spin off. And there's a spacer washer underneath it, don't lose that. Next, we have 4 T25 bolts that hold the shroud onto the engine. Once these are removed, the shroud still won't lift off until we remove this grommet for the spark plug wire. You can just pop this out by hand, and now the shroud can lift off, exposing the engine. This is our ignition coil, the guy we need to replace. He's held on with 2 T25 bolts. These are pretty tight, so I'm going to use the ratchet to break them loose. Underneath one of the bolts is a wire for the kill switch, and then there's a second wire for the kill switch connected to this terminal here. Now on the last string trimmer we worked on, I was able to salvage the old coil by cleaning the rust off of the laminations here. This one is pretty clean, so we're not going to be able to do that. We're going to have to replace the coil with a new one. Here's the coil that I'm using. Yours might use a different coil. I recommend getting a genuine Husqvarna coil. With as much work as this is to replace, you don't want to have to do it all over again because you bought a junk coil. I'm going to bolt this into position, making sure to attach that kill switch wire under one of the bolts. I'm not going to fully tighten the bolts yet because we need to set the coil air gap. And to do that, we need the coil to be a little loose. And now we can pull out our rope. I know you might want to leave it in there to soak, but right now we need to be able to rotate the engine to set the air gap. So we got to pull out. I'm putting a 10 thou feeler gauge in between the flywheel and the coil. Then I'll rotate the flywheel so that the magnets are right under the coil. This will pull the coil towards the flywheel and pinch the feeler gauge. Now we can do the final torque on the coil mounting bolts. To remove the feeler gauge, just rotate the flywheel so the magnets are no longer right beneath the coil, and then you can just pull the gauge out. And then we'll give it a spin to make sure that nothing got bound up. Also remember to connect that second kill switch wire to the coil here. Now you can't spin the engine over fast enough with your hand to test for spark. So I'm going to hook up a cordless drill to the output shaft and use that to spin the engine over. I don't want to get everything put back together and then find out that I got a defective coil. So here you can see we now have spark again. So I'm comfortable putting everything back together now. Now, we gotta push rope again. We're gonna have that same issue when we go to reinstall the clutch, so we need to stop the engine from turning again. When putting the shroud back on, we need to be mindful of the throttle cable and the kill switch wire. So I'm gonna feed those through the slot in the shroud first. and then feed the spark plug wire through, and then get the shroud lined up, and now we can tighten our bolts. I'm going to use the ratchet on these since these thread directly into the engine block. Then we need to drop that spacer washer back on and then reinstall the clutch. This time we'll turn it in the opposite direction of the arrow to tighten it. You can get a new clutch on Amazon, but this one was in pretty good shape, so I was comfortable reinstalling it. And then the clutch drum. The clutch drum should spin freely once installed. And now we can pull out our rope. Reinstall the spark plug grommet. Now the wire on the new coil is a little bit longer than the one that was on the old coil. And when I went to reinstall the plug, I noticed that the boot wasn't seating all the way on the plug. So what I ended up doing is cutting about an inch off of that wire and then reusing the old boot from the old coil. That seemed to work okay. For the handle, I'm going to put the left side on first. Here I am connecting the kill switch wire, and then the two screws that secure the handle to the shroud. The wire routing is a little tricky. You have to get the wires into that little groove inside the handle. They need to go under the throttle cable. And then the throttle cable gets retained with that T15 screw. The end of the throttle cable goes into a slot in the trigger. And then we'll put this back in and make sure it works. And then we can put the right side handle back on. Now we can slide the shaft back into the power head. You might have to wiggle it around a little bit to get it to engage. That middle bolt here is what secures the shaft to the head. We need to make sure that the hole in the shaft is lined up before tightening it. And then I'll put the rest of the bolts in that secure the handle. So now we're ready to fire it up. I'm going to fill up the tank with premix. Turn on the choke. Prime it until we see fuel flowing. And it's still not going to start. I fiddled around with it for a while. This is when I noticed that that spark plug wire wasn't fully seating on the spark plug. After I fixed that, I was able to get it to pop over, but it would die right away. I ended up having to richen up the idle mixture on the carb to get it to idle. Here's a close-up of what I was doing. The adjustment on the right is for the low idle, and the one on the left is for the high speed. I also had to lean out the high speed. It wasn't revving up all the way at full throttle. I'm hoping it doesn't have an air leak or some other issue. It was about 30 degrees out when I did this, so I'm sure that's affecting it. I'll do the final adjustments on it in the spring once it gets warmer out. I'm just glad to get it running now. Thanks everyone for watching. Be sure to check out my other small engine videos. See you later. Bye.